Picture this: a medieval castle under siege. The sky is the color of iron. Smoke crawls along the ground. Below the walls, siege engines creak as men haul on ropes slick with mud and rain. And up on the battlements, a single knight stands where everyone can see him. Still, defiant, and ready to die before he yields. Now hold that image. Because in one standoff that people still whisper about almost 1,000 years later, a king tried to win a siege without firing a single stone. It was the year 1152, during England's Civil War, an era of shifting loyalties and broken promises that chroniclers would later call the Anarchy. King Stephen had a castle surrounded, and to force a surrender, he did something that should have ended the fight instantly. He took a child hostage. Then he made his threat. If the garrison didn't give up, he would launch the boy, by catapult, straight into the castle wall. A sick silence fell over the battlefield. Not even the soldiers jeered. Everyone waited for the same thing: a father's surrender. Because the boy's father was inside the castle. A hard man, a veteran, a knight named John Marshall. Stephen expected pleading, begging, a deal, anything. Instead, John Marshall looked down from the battlements and answered coldly, so cold it sounded like steel being drawn from a sheath. He still has the hammers and anvils to forge a better son. Think about what that means. It wasn't courage in the storybook sense. It was war stripped bare. A statement that said, "You cannot buy me with grief." And then something extraordinary happened. The king hesitated. The siege didn't end with a child screaming through the air. Stephen backed off. Whether from political calculation, fear of outrage, or a flicker of conscience, we can't say. But he blinked. And the boy lived. That child was William Marshall, who would grow into one of the most famous knights of the Middle Ages, often called the greatest knight of his age. That single moment, one man refusing to bend, one king choosing not to cross a line, tells you more about the medieval world than 100 shiny tales of courtly chivalry. Because the Middle Ages weren't built on perfect honor. They were built on pressure, on extortion, on survival, on men who swore oaths and men who broke them. And that's the road we're walking today. Not towards the polished paragons of chivalry from romance stories, but toward the rebel knights. The ones who defied kings, rejected their chains of loyalty, and lived by rules of their own making. Some were heroic, some were cunning, some were cruel enough to make your stomach turn. But all of them were unforgettable, and all of them forced the world around them to react. This isn't a tale of perfect virtue. This is a tale of sparks in dry grass. Over the next hour, you're going to meet fighters who didn't simply serve history. They shoved it. Men who turned geography into a weapon, who turned exile into opportunity, who turned words into blades. And our first path leads far away from court halls and tournament grounds. It leads into water, into mud, into a place where the land itself seems to breathe. Because when the Normans conquered England after 1066, most of the kingdom bent under the new iron rule. Some submitted, some were broken, some disappeared into history like footprints in wet soil. But one region refused to sink: the Fenlands. A swampy, shifting world of black water, reed forests, narrow causeways, and hidden paths that only locals knew. A place where heavy armor drags you down, where horses panic, where an army can't move like an army anymore. And inside that landscape, resistance didn't just survive. Resistance learned to hunt. Here, an English nobleman emerged from the fog with a name that sounded like a warning. Hereward the Wake. The Wake means the watchful, the one who stays awake while others sleep, the one who sees what's coming. He wasn't a knight in the neat Norman sense with polished heraldry and courtly ceremony. He was something older, an Anglo-Saxon war leader shaped by loss and fury. The kind of man who doesn't ask permission to exist. According to later chronicles and tradition, Hereward had been exiled in his youth, and when he returned he found the world rewritten. His land seized, his family standing erased, Norman men wearing Norman symbols sitting where his people once sat. And the Fenlands gave him a choice: disappear or become a story. He chose the story. He vanished into the marsh and began gathering the broken pieces of England, dispossessed nobles, refugees, outlaws, men who had nothing left to lose. And from that, he built something the conquerors couldn't understand. Not a kingdom, a resistance. Quiet at first, like ripples moving through reeds. A patrol that doesn't return. A storehouse burned in the night. A tax collector who rides out and never rides back. And always the same feeling spreading through the Norman ranks. That the swamp had eyes. That the land was awake. This is where our saga truly begins. Because Hereward's war won't be fought in open fields under bright banners. It will be fought in silence, in smoke, and in sudden violence. Against an empire that believes it has already won. And when the conqueror finally turns his gaze toward that last stubborn pocket of resistance, the Fenlands will teach him something he never wanted to learn. A crown can claim land on a map, but a crown cannot command mud, water, and fear. So, take a breath. Listen to the wind through the reeds.
Fog lies low over the Fenlands. Not the gentle kind of fog that makes a morning look poetic. This one feels like a lid. It smothers sound. It hides distance. It turns water into a mirror you can't trust. Out here, the ground isn't ground. It's a negotiation. One wrong step and you don't fall. You sink. The reeds stand like 1,000 spears. The channels of black water twist and vanish. And in the middle of all that, you begin to understand why armored men hate this place. Because the Fenlands don't fight you like an army does. The Fenlands fight you like the earth itself. And that's where I first heard the name. Hereward. Not in a court, not in a chapel, but from fishermen with cracked hands and sharp eyes, from villagers who spoke softly as if the reeds might be listening. Some said it like a prayer, others like a warning. Hereward the Wake. The Wake means the watchful one, the one who stays awake, the one who keeps watch while everyone else sleeps. But people here meant something more than that. They meant a man who refused to bend, a man who stood up when the rest of the kingdom had been forced to kneel. After the Norman conquest, after 1066, England changed hands fast. The new rulers brought their language, their laws, their castles, their knights. Many English lords were killed, stripped, replaced. Others submitted because they saw no choice. But the Fenlands didn't submit easily. Because you can't ride through a field and claim it. You can't build a keep on a hill and dominate the countryside. You can't dominate water the same way. You can't put a fortress on mud and expect it to behave. And in those years, when England was still bleeding from conquest, Hereward returned. Some stories say he had been exiled as a youth. The reasons shift depending on who is telling it. Anger, violence, feuding, pride. Medieval sources aren't always clean, and they don't always agree. But the shape of the story is clear enough. He left young and came back to find his world stolen. His lands were no longer his family standing, erased. Norman men were living where his people had lived, collecting rents where his father had ruled, and riding across the countryside as if England had always belonged to them. If you want to understand what that does to a man, don't imagine a single moment of rage. Imagine a quiet shock, the kind that makes your stomach go cold, the kind that sits behind your eyes and changes how you breathe. Hereward didn't go to law. He didn't beg for mercy. He disappeared into the fog. And then the Fenlands started telling stories. At first, the stories were small, the kind that might be coincidence. A Norman patrol that rides out along a causeway and doesn't return. A tax collector who vanishes on the road, his horse found later, sweating and riderless. A storehouse that burns in the night, clean, fast, and gone before anyone can form a bucket line. And then there were signs, little things that meant nothing to outsiders, but everything to the locals. A reed bundle tied with red thread left where a road meets water. A piece of sedge placed on a gatepost. A mark that said without a single spoken word, "The land is awake." Norman soldiers didn't understand it, but they felt it. You can't teach a man to feel safe in a place where the ground itself lies to him. Heavy mail turns into a punishment. A horse's strength becomes a liability. Every splash in the dark starts to sound like a step behind you. And Hereward used that. He wasn't a knight in the polished Norman sense, tournament rules, courtly titles, romance songs. He was closer to an older kind of war leader, practical, harsh, and shaped by terrain. The Fenlands made him what he became, and he made the Fenlands into a weapon. Soon, he wasn't alone. The marsh gathers people the way the sea gathers wreckage. Refugees, dispossessed nobles, outlaws, men whose homes had been taken, whose families had been scattered, whose loyalty to the new order was already broken. And because the Normans controlled the roads and the towns, those broken men drifted to the one place where Norman cavalry could not easily chase them: into the reeds. Hereward gathered them there, not like a king assembling a court, but like a hunter building a pack. He taught them what to listen for, how to move without splashing, how to step on firmer tussocks, how to vanish in fog in a way that makes pursuers lose not only the trail, but their confidence. And he taught them the one rule that matters when you're outnumbered: never fight the enemy on the enemy's terms. So, they didn't stand in open fields. They struck narrow causeways where you can't flank. They hit supply wagons at the marsh edge where oxen bog down and men panic. They raided quickly and pulled back before reinforcements could arrive. Sometimes they took food, sometimes weapons, sometimes information. And sometimes, just sometimes, they struck simply to remind the conquerors that victory wasn't complete. The effect wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Norman soldiers began to talk about the Fenlands like sailors talk about bad water, a place where maps don't help you, a place that swallows men whole, a place where you start imagining shapes in fog. And that's how rebellions survive, not by winning every fight, but by refusing to die, by turning the conqueror's certainty into doubt. As the months dragged on, Hereward's name traveled. It moved from whispers in taverns to worried reports carried by messengers. It reached the men that mattered. And then something happened that lifted the rebellion from a local nuisance to a national threat. Across the sea, Danish forces appeared, briefly, offering support to the English resistance. The exact scale and motives are debated, but the impact is clear. It gave the rebels momentum, and it gave Hereward the chance to turn the Fenlands into something more than a hiding place, a fortress. The heart of that fortress was Ely, an island of higher ground in the Sea of Marsh. It wasn't an island in the ocean sense, it was an island in the Fenland sense, reachable only by paths you had to know, defended by water and mud and reeds that could swallow an army's advantage. Ely also had something else. The great abbey church rising above the flat land like a stone mast. A sacred structure, yes, but also a landmark, a rallying point.
Morning over Ely didn't arrive like a sunrise.
It arrived like a slow lifting of a curtain. Fog lay across the fenlands in pale sheets. The water was black and still, reeds clicking softly in the wind like dry bones. And beyond that gray veil you could hear it, wood on wood, iron on stone, men shouting measurements, the steady rhythm of an army building something that wasn't there yesterday. The Normans had finally decided they were done being mocked by mud. William the Conqueror's men didn't come to Ely to negotiate, they came to erase the last stubborn bruise on their victory. And when brute force couldn't simply ride in and crush resistance, they did what disciplined conquerors always do. They engineered a way through. At the marsh edge, Norman labor gangs worked from dawn to dusk. They threw fascines, bundles of brush, into the water. They drove stakes down into soft ground. They laid timber and hurdles, building narrow causeways one hard step at a time. It was slow, back-breaking work, and the Fenlands fought them the entire way. Boots sank, wagons stalled, horses panicked at the shifting ground. Armor that made a knight feel invincible on dry land became a weight dragging him down. Every step was a negotiation with water. But the causeways grew, and the siege tightened. From Ely, Hereward watched it all through reed screens and mist. He didn't meet them in open battle. He let them come just far enough to feel confident, and then reminded them what kind of war this was. A Norman probing party advanced single file along a new path into thicker fog. Spear points bobbed, shields scraped reeds. Their formation looked strong from a distance, until you noticed how narrow the path was, how close the water waded on both sides, how easily one shove could turn discipline into drowning. Harold's men were already there, crouched low, faces smeared with mud, breathing shallow. And when Hereward signaled, just 2 fingers then a closed fist, the Fenland struck. A spear thrust didn't need to kill, it only needed to unbalance. A shield shove didn't need to win honor, it only needed to send a man's weight the wrong way. One Norman stumbled, armor heavy, footing gone, and the water took him with a sound that was more swallow than splash. The rest tried to retreat, but retreating on a narrow causeway in fog is its own kind of defeat. They backed up, shields high, boots slipping, nerves breaking. And the rebels vanished again into reeds as if the marsh had opened and closed around them. That was the pattern: build, probe, fail, withdraw, over and over. So the Normans changed tactics. If they couldn't break Ely with steel alone, they would break it with fear. They began raising a tall wooden siege tower near the marsh edge, timbers lashed together, cross-braced, hauled upright by ropes and pulleys. It rose above the reeds like a crude, arrogant monument, meant to dominate sightlines and spirit alike. And then, in one of those details that sits halfway between history and legend, later accounts claim the Normans added something stranger still. They brought a so-called wise woman, someone the stories label a witch, and placed her atop the tower. High above the marsh, she began to chant curses and prophecies down toward Ely, her voice carrying across water and fog, like a bird call that doesn't belong. Now, whether that happened exactly as later storytellers describe, we can't prove. Medieval chroniclers loved a dramatic symbol. But the symbol itself fits the psychology of war. The conquerors wanted the defenders to feel watched, doomed, spiritually outmatched. They wanted superstition to do what swords could not. On Ely's earthworks, men shifted uneasily. Some crossed themselves. Some stared at the tower as if staring too long might invite bad luck into their bones. The chanting echoed strangely across the fenlands, thin, warped by mist, like a bird call that doesn't belong. Hereward listened, and then he did something that tells you exactly what kind of rebel he was. He smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was useful, because it revealed something he could exploit. The enemy was trying to frighten them instead of breaking them. That meant the enemy was starting to doubt. Hereward turned his head toward a patch of higher reeds, dry enough to catch, dry enough to race, and he gave one quiet order, the kind that doesn't belong in songs but wins wars. Burn. Men slipped away through reed corridors, low and silent, carrying wrapped torches and tinder. They didn't run. Running makes noise. Running makes splashes. They moved like locals, stepping where the ground holds, pausing where it doesn't. Then the first flame caught at the base of the reeds. At first it was almost nothing, a small orange tongue licking up a stalk. But the fenlands have two seasons, water and fire. When the reeds dry, they burn fast and low, like a living thing racing across the surface. The wind fed it, the fog lit up from beneath. Smoke rose in a thick column and rolled outward, turning day into a copper-colored dusk. The Normans shouted, panicked, tried to form bucket lines, tried to stamp down the fire. But reeds don't stamp down like grass. They collapse, they flare, they run. And as the flames spread, the wooden siege tower began to glow at its base. Pitch and dry timber caught, ropes smoked, braces groaned. Up on the platform, the chanting stopped. Whether it was a wise woman, a paid performer, or a figure invented later by chroniclers, the point remains. The tower, meant to terrify Ely, became a beacon of disaster for the besiegers. And when a structure like that starts to fail, it doesn't fail politely. It fails by physics. Supports weaken, joints loosen, weight shifts. The tower tilts slowly at first, almost gently. Then the angle increases, gravity takes over, and the whole thing becomes unstoppable. Beams snapped with a sharp crack. Embers burst. The tower folded inward, then crashed into mud and burning reeds with a heavy, brutal impact that sent smoke and ash billowing outward. In the confusion, exactly where Hereward wanted it, Ely struck back. The rebels surged from reed cover, not in a glorious charge, but in a controlled, ugly rush. Shields up, axes ready, feet slipping and recovering, breasts loud inside wet cloth and mail fragments. They hit the Norman line where it was weakest, at the edges where men were turning, blinded by smoke, shouting at each other, not sure which orders mattered. Hereward's fighters didn't duel for honor. They shoved, jabbed, and struck with short, decisive movement. After Ely fell, the fenlands went quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way a battlefield goes quiet after the shouting stops. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own breathing and you start noticing things you didn't notice during the fighting. Ash floating on the water, broken arrows half sunk in mud, charred reeds bending in the wind like blackened hair. The Normans held the abbey precinct. They planted their banner where the mist still clung to stone. They posted guards on the causeways and turned the sacred island into a garrison. From a distance, it looked like order had returned. Up close, it looked like exhaustion on both sides. The conquerors had won, but the fenlands had made them pay for every foot of it. And the people who lived there knew something the conquerors didn't want to admit. Ely was taken, but the marsh was not conquered. Hereward was gone. No body, no triumphal capture, no neat ending to write into a royal record. And that is exactly the sort of history struggles with, because history likes clean conclusions. It likes traitors executed, heroes crowned, rebels broken. Hereward slipped through the fingers of the victors like water through a clenched fist. The sources don't agree on what happened next. Some traditions say he kept fighting, slipping through forests and wetlands, striking when he could until he died in a later clash. Other stories suggest he accepted a pardon and vanished into ordinary life, a wolf forced to wear a collar. We can't say for certain, but the uncertainty is part of his power. A man without a confirmed ending becomes a shape people can fill with what they need: fear, hope, pride, warning. And in the fenlands, people needed him. Because the Normans didn't only bring soldiers, they brought a new way of living, new law, new taxes, new landlords. They built castles as symbols, hard stone teeth sunk into English soil. They rewrote ownership with parchment and seals, and they expected everyone to accept it as natural. For many, Hereward became proof that it wasn't natural. He became the story people told when they wanted to remember that someone had stood up, even if only for a while. In a village hut, you can imagine the scene. A low fire, smoke under the rafters, children quiet, adults speaking in half voices. Someone says, "They took Eli." Someone else says, "Yes, but they never took the marsh." And then a name is spoken like a secret. Hereward. Not as a saint, not a perfect hero, but as something stubborn enough to survive defeat. Sometimes that's the only kind of hero people can afford. The Norman soldiers who stayed in the region learned to fear the landscape in a different way. Patrolling the reed banks, prodding mud with spear tips, watching their reflections tremble in black water, they felt it, the sense that the land could hide a man forever if it wanted to. And the locals, even the ones who never raised a weapon, held on to small symbols, a reed bundle tied with thread, a scratch on a tabletop, a story that begins with, "I heard he was exiled, and then he came back." That's how legends travel, not on banners, on breath. Zaragoza at night feels like a city holding its breath. Oil lamps throw soft pools of light under arches. White plaster walls glow faintly in the dark. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, you can hear the distant bark of a guard and the restless stamp of horses. The air smells of dust, leather, and smoke. And walking through that silence is a man who should not be here, at least not by the rules people like to pretend existed. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar is a Christian knight, exiled from his own king's service, now standing in a Muslim Taifa court, not begging for mercy, but offering something far more valuable: victory. That's the first thing you have to understand about Rodrigo. He treats war like a profession. He doesn't romanticize it. He doesn't pretend it's clean. He understands it as a trade, paid in coin, secured by discipline, and judged by results. And Zaragoza wanted results. So Rodrigo took service here, and in doing so, he stepped into the narrow space between worlds, Christian and Muslim, court and camp, faith and necessity. It was dangerous ground, but Rodrigo seemed built for dangerous ground. In the palaces of Zaragoza, people began calling him a title in Arabic, Al-Said, the Lord. In Castilian mouths, it became the name that would follow him forever, El Cid. Not a name born from a church blessing, a name born from usefulness, from respect earned the hard way. And once his men started winning under him, once he began breaking rival forces, reading terrain, keeping order under pressure, another label tightened around him like a second belt: Campeador, the champion of the battlefield. You can picture him at dawn outside the walls, dust rising in thin veils, riders and infantry lined up in the pale light, different languages, different prayers, one discipline. Rodrigo walks the line, not shouting, not theatrically inspiring. He adjusts a man's spear angle with a quick touch. He corrects a rider's spacing with a small hand signal. Everything about him says the same thing: if you follow me, you live longer. And they followed. Because he was effective. He fought the way an exiled man fights, like every battle is a step away from starving, and every victory is a brick in the wall of a future he's building with his own hands. During these years, he did something that would have looked like betrayal to many Christians back home. He fought other Christians when it suited his contract. Rival kingdoms, rival counts, enemies today, allies tomorrow, and if you're unlucky, pray both days. That reality is uncomfortable, but it's honest. Iberia wasn't a neat war of two faiths, it was a shifting mosaic of politics, money, and survival. Rodrigo learned to navigate that mosaic better than anyone. He didn't just win battles, he learned courts, he learned how to speak to rulers, how to read a room, how to make an alliance feel inevitable. He became fluent, not only in language, but in leverage. And when you live long enough in that world, you start to understand a brutal truth. Loyalty is negotiable. The only loyalty that really lasts is loyalty to your own survival, your own reputation, your own band of men. Which brings us to the second great turning point in his life, because while Rodrigo was forging a new identity in Zaragoza, the world beyond him was changing fast. In the year 1086, a new force shook Iberia, the Almoravids, coming across from North Africa. They were disciplined, ideologically driven, and organized in a way many Taifa states were not. They weren't just another rival, they were an empire moving with purpose. And when King Alfonso VI faced them at Sagrajas as La Zalaca, he was badly beaten. Suddenly, the king who had exiled Rodrigo found himself staring into a future where Castile could be swallowed. So Alfonso did what rulers do when pride becomes too expensive. He reached for the sharpest blade he had thrown away. A messenger rode hard, dust trailing behind him, carrying a sealed recall letter into Rodrigo's camp. The camp itself was practical, tents low, horses tethered, men sleeping with weapons close. Not a court, a machine. Rodrigo took the letter, broke the seal without ceremony, read in silence. And as he read, you can almost see the memory of Burgos in his eyes, the doors shut, the city turning away, the cold humiliation of being made untouchable by a king's command. Rodrigo could have refused. He could have laughed and tossed the letter into the fire. But he didn't. He folded it neatly. And for a moment, he sat very still, because this wasn't just an invitation. It was a test. A chance to return, but on what terms? As a servant? Or as a man who has already proven he can build power without royal permission? He called his captains. They gathered close around a small fire at dawn, breath visible in the cool air, the smell of leather and smoke in their cloaks. Rodrigo spoke quietly, no grand speech, just simple, cold clarity. They would go. Not because Rodrigo had forgiven Alfonso, but because the war demanded it, and Rodrigo understood that every crisis is an opportunity to reposition yourself closer to what you really want. They rode. Across harsh terrain, through valleys and hills, crossing shallow fords where water splashed and clung to hooves. They approached the royal encampment, banners, guards, tents like a small city. Rodrigo dismounted and walked forward with controlled respect. Alfonso watched him approach. Guards hovered like shadows, advisors hanging like shadows. The reunion was not warm, it was not sentimental. It was two powerful men acknowledging necessity while remembering betrayal. A nod, a few words, no more than needed. And then, like always, they turned to the map. In the king's war tent, the air smelled of candle wax, sweat, and parchment. Plans were spread out. Roads, rivers, fortresses, the movement of armies. Rodrigo's finger moved across the lines with decisive precision. But while others looked only at the immediate threat, Rodrigo's eyes kept drifting east, because beyond the urgency of the Almoravid storm, there was a prize waiting, rich, strategic, and exposed in the way great prizes always are. Valencia. A city on the Mediterranean, where trade ran through its gates, where wealth moved through its markets, where the sea itself could carry supplies and reinforcements. A city that was more than land. A city that could be power. Rodrigo didn't say it like a dream. He said it like a calculation, like a man choosing the next step on a long road. And here is the deeper point. Rodrigo's rebellion isn't loud. It isn't a banner raised against a king with a speech about freedom. Rodrigo rebels by refusing to be owned. He serves when it benefits him. He leaves when it doesn't. He keeps his men loyal to him, not to a throne. He bends, but he does not break. And he never forgets the moment Burgos closed its doors. So when he rides out from Alfonso's camp again, he rides with something new in his mind. Not just survival, not just reputation, but an objective that can't be taken away by a royal seal. A city, a base, a crown, in all but name. That's what makes this moment so dangerous. Rodrigo isn't returning to the king, he's moving past the king. In the quiet nights that followed, campfires low, wind moving through scrub, Rodrigo sharpened his blade slowly, deliberately, like a ritual. His men slept in short shifts. Scouts listened for movement in the dark.
Zaragoza at night feels like a city holding its breath. Oil lamps throw soft pools of light under arches. White plaster walls glow faintly in the dark. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, you can hear the distant bark of a guard and the restless stamp of horses. The air smells of dust, leather, and smoke. And walking through that silence is a man who should not be here, at least not by the rules people like to pretend existed. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar is a Christian knight, exiled from his own king's service, now standing in a Muslim Taifa court, not begging for mercy, but offering something far more valuable: victory. That's the first thing you have to understand about Rodrigo. He treats war like a profession. He doesn't romanticize it. He doesn't pretend it's clean. He understands it as a trade, paid in coin, secured by discipline, and judged by results. And Zaragoza wanted results. So Rodrigo took service here, and in doing so, he stepped into the narrow space between worlds, Christian and Muslim, court and camp, faith and necessity. It was dangerous ground, but Rodrigo seemed built for dangerous ground. In the palaces of Zaragoza, people began calling him a title in Arabic, Al-Said, the Lord. In Castilian mouths, it became the name that would follow him forever, El Cid. Not a name born from a church blessing, a name born from usefulness, from respect earned the hard way. And once his men started winning under him, once he began breaking rival forces, reading terrain, keeping order under pressure, another label tightened around him like a second belt: Campeador, the champion of the battlefield. You can picture him at dawn outside the walls, dust rising in thin veils, riders and infantry lined up in the pale light, different languages, different prayers, one discipline. Rodrigo walks the line, not shouting, not theatrically inspiring. He adjusts a man's spear angle with a quick touch. He corrects a rider's spacing with a small hand signal. Everything about him says the same thing: if you follow me, you live longer. And they followed. Because he was effective. He fought the way an exiled man fights, like every battle is a step away from starving, and every victory is a brick in the wall of a future he's building with his own hands. During these years, he did something that would have looked like betrayal to many Christians back home. He fought other Christians when it suited his contract. Rival kingdoms, rival counts, enemies today, allies tomorrow, and if you're unlucky, pray both days. That reality is uncomfortable, but it's honest. Iberia wasn't a neat war of two faiths. It was a shifting mosaic of politics, money, and survival. Rodrigo learned to navigate that mosaic better than anyone. He didn't just win battles. He learned courts. He learned how to speak to rulers, how to read a room, how to make an alliance feel inevitable. He became fluent, not only in language, but in leverage. And when you live long enough in that world, you start to understand a brutal truth. Loyalty is negotiable. The only loyalty that really lasts is loyalty to your own survival, your own reputation, your own band of men. Which brings us to the second great turning point in his life, because while Rodrigo was forging a new identity in Zaragoza, the world beyond him was changing fast. In the year 1086, a new force shook Iberia, the Almoravids, coming across from North Africa. They were disciplined, ideologically driven, and organized in a way many Taifa states were not. They weren't just another rival, they were an empire moving with purpose. And when King Alfonso VI faced them at Sagrajas as La Zalaca, he was badly beaten. Suddenly, the king who had exiled Rodrigo found himself staring into a future where Castile could be swallowed. So Alfonso did what rulers do when pride becomes too expensive. He reached for the sharpest blade he had thrown away. A messenger rode hard, dust trailing behind him, carrying a sealed recall letter into Rodrigo's camp. The camp itself was practical, tents low, horses tethered, men sleeping with weapons close. Not a court, a machine. Rodrigo took the letter, broke the seal without ceremony, read in silence. And as he read, you can almost see the memory of Burgos in his eyes, the doors shut, the city turning away, the cold humiliation of being made untouchable by a king's command. Rodrigo could have refused. He could have laughed and tossed the letter into the fire. But he didn't. He folded it neatly. And for a moment, he sat very still, because this wasn't just an invitation. It was a test. A chance to return, but on what terms? As a servant? Or as a man who has already proven he can build power without royal permission? He called his captains. They gathered close around a small fire at dawn, breath visible in the cool air, the smell of leather and smoke in their cloaks. Rodrigo spoke quietly. No grand speech, just simple, cold clarity. They would go. Not because Rodrigo had forgiven Alfonso, but because the war demanded it, and Rodrigo understood that every crisis is an opportunity to reposition yourself closer to what you really want. They rode. Across harsh terrain, through valleys and hills, crossing shallow fords where water splashed and clung to hooves. They approached the royal encampment, banners, guards, tents like a small city. Rodrigo dismounted and walked forward with controlled respect. Alfonso watched him approach. Guards hovered like shadows, advisors hanging like shadows. The reunion was not warm. It was not sentimental. It was two powerful men acknowledging necessity while remembering betrayal. A nod, a few words, no more than needed. And then, like always, they turned to the map. In the king's war tent, the air smelled of candle wax, sweat, and parchment. Plans were spread out, roads, rivers, fortresses, the movement of armies. Rodrigo's finger moved across the lines with decisive precision. But while others looked only at the immediate threat, Rodrigo's eyes kept drifting east. Because beyond the urgency of the Almoravid storm, there was a prize waiting, rich, strategic.
Valencia doesn't look like a prize from far away. From the ridge, it's just pale walls and towers floating in sea haze, like a mirage someone forgot to erase. The Mediterranean glints behind it. The wind off the water carries salt and dust together, and the light feels sharper here than it ever did in Castile. But Rodrigo Diaz knows what he's looking at. A city like Valencia isn't just stone. It's commerce, it's leverage, it's a harbor and a gate and a treasury all at once. And in an Iberia where alliances rot overnight, a city like this can be the closest thing to a crown a man without royal blood will ever wear. Rodrigo doesn't smile when he sees it. He doesn't raise a sword to the sky. He just nods, once, as if he's confirming a calculation he made long ago. Then, he rides down into the plain. The first days aren't glorious. They're practical. Rodrigo sets his camp with discipline. Sentries placed, horses protected, supplies guarded. He sends scouts to the roads. He studies the orchards and irrigation channels, the low stone walls, the small farms outside the city. He learns the ground the way Hereward learned the marsh, because every great rebel, in the end, is a student of terrain. Valencia watches him from its walls. Lookouts lean over the parapets. Guards tighten their grips on spear shafts. Inside the city, markets grow tense. People begin to hoard. Doors close earlier. Not because arrows are already falling, but because everyone can feel what's coming. A siege isn't only a military act, it's a slow tightening around the human throat. Rodrigo understands that. He doesn't need to storm the walls. He needs to make the city feel smaller every day. He begins with diplomacy, because diplomacy is cheaper than assault. Envoys move between the camp and the gate, walking carefully on neutral ground. Terms are offered, conditions are tested, messages travel back and forth in guarded language, but no one trusts anyone. Inside Valencia, factions argue, advisors disagree. The city isn't one mind, it's many minds fighting each other while an enemy waits outside. Outside, Rodrigo doesn't rush. That's what makes him terrifying. He doesn't waste men in a heroic charge that looks good in a song. He builds the cage first. Roads are watched, supply carts are halted, grain sacks are inspected. A caravan that might have fed the city instead feeds Rodrigo's camp, or is turned back. It's systematic, steady, and cruel in the way all sieges are. And when the city tries to bite back, when a small sortie slips out at night, hoping to burn a siege line or kill a sentry, Rodrigo meets it with the same discipline. There's no panic, no chaos on his side. A horn call, a hand signal, men closing ranks, shields bracing, spear points rising in short, controlled angles. The clash is brutal but contained. Shoves, short thrusts, bodies recoiling with the weight of armor, boots slipping in dust and recovering. Then the city's men fall back behind the gate, and the siege continues. The next morning, Rodrigo's men repair what was damaged. Stakes are reset, palisades are tightened. The machine keeps running. Inside Valencia, the cost begins to show. Food becomes a problem long before the walls break. Bread becomes smaller, soup becomes thinner. People begin to look at each other differently, less like neighbors, more like competitors for survival. A mother weighs a loaf in her hands and breaks it carefully for her child. A merchant counts coins that no longer buy what he needs. A soldier on the wall stares out at Rodrigo's camp with exhausted eyes, wondering how long a city can hold its breath. Rodrigo isn't blind to this, but he isn't moved by it either, not enough to loosen the pressure. In the medieval world, mercy often arrives only after victory. At some point, the conversation changes. Diplomacy becomes less about compromise and more about surrender. And when Rodrigo escalates, he does it like everything else, methodically. Siege engines appear, timber frames, ropes, crews pulling in rhythm, traction trebuchets and mangonels, the kind of machines that don't look elegant but work. Ropes tighten, slings cradle stone. The crews pull, sweat and dust mixing on their arms. Then, the release. The arm swings with heavy, believable inertia. The stone lifts, arcs, and falls. No magic, just gravity. And it hits the wall with a crack that shakes dust from rooftops. Inside the city, people run. Not like heroes, but like civilians, because that's what they are. Shutters slam, children scream, dust fills the air. The walls don't collapse instantly, but the message is clear. The siege is no longer only hunger, it is impact. And then, at last, the gate opens. Not wide, not proudly. It opens like a reluctant confession. The hinges complain. Guards step back with faces drained of sleep. The city gives way, not because it has been conquered in one dramatic moment, but because the slow pressure has done its work. Rodrigo rides in at a walking pace. No looting frenzy, no grand celebration. His men keep formation. Spear points remain upright. He enters like a man stepping into a room he has already decided belongs to him. The crowd watches from doorways and corners, silent, tense, unsure whether this new lord will bring massacre or order. Rodrigo's expression doesn't change. That's what makes him dangerous as a ruler. He doesn't need to perform, he simply acts. He posts guards at key intersections, he secures the gates, he begins administration. Because a city is not a trophy, it is a mechanism. It must keep working. Markets, taxes, water, security, or it will rebel from the inside. And here's the most striking thing. Rodrigo becomes a Christian lord over a city where many inhabitants are Muslim. The simple story would be blood and expulsion, but Rodrigo is too practical for that. He needs the city.
Antioch, under Levantine's son, doesn't feel like Europe. It feels like the edge of the world. Stone walls bake in the heat, dust hangs in the air, and the streets are full of people who don't trust each other. Frankish knights in mail, Greek merchants, Armenian soldiers, Arab traders, Latin priests, each group moving through the same city like travelers sharing a narrow bridge. This is where Reynald of Chatillon walks in and decides he will answer to no one. He arrives in the east like many men did, chasing glory, chasing salvation, chasing fortune. But Reynald's true faith isn't in heaven, it's in himself. He climbs fast, not because he's patient or wise, but because the Crusader states are desperate and divided, and bold men often rise in broken worlds. Through marriage, Reynald becomes the effective ruler of Antioch, marrying Constance, the princess of the city, and almost immediately he begins acting less like a guardian and more like a storm. Antioch needs alliances, Reynald makes enemies. Antioch needs discipline, Reynald makes chaos. And the first people to learn that are not Muslims, but his fellow Christians. One of the most infamous stories attached to his name comes from chroniclers who clearly hated him, but the core is hard to ignore. Reynald used violence and humiliation against the Latin patriarch of Antioch to extort money. Imagine the scandal of that in a Crusader state, torturing the church's highest local authority, treating a patriarch like an animal, all because Reynald wanted coin for his ambitions. Whether every detail in the story is exact or embellished, the meaning is the same. Reynald was willing to violate even the sacred to get what he wanted. He didn't just bend the rules of knighthood, he ripped them up and used them as kindling. Then came Cyprus. In the mid-1200s, specifically 1156, Reynald took part in a raid on the Byzantine island of Cyprus, a Christian land aligned with the Crusader world. It should have been untouchable. Instead, it was looted. Villages were stripped, churches were violated, people suffered. The point wasn't strategy, it was plunder, wrapped in an excuse. And with every act like this, Reynald became more dangerous to his own side. Because the Crusader states survived on fragile diplomacy, they needed truces, they needed cooperation with Byzantium, they needed the appearance of legitimacy. Reynald didn't care. Eventually, the world pushed back. The Byzantines were outraged, and even fellow Crusaders were disgusted enough to consider handing Reynald over for punishment. To save himself, Reynald did something so humiliating that it burned into memory. He went to Constantinople and begged for mercy. There are accounts that describe him kneeling with a rope around his neck, submitting himself like a condemned man, asking Emperor Manuel I to spare him. It's an image that sums him up perfectly. A man capable of monstrous arrogance, and also capable of swallowing absolute humiliation if it meant he could live to cause trouble again. And troublemakers like him often survive longer than they deserve. For a while, fate removed him from the board. In 1164, at the Battle of Harim, Reynald was captured and spent roughly 16 years in a Muslim prison at Aleppo. Most men would come out broken. Reynald came out sharpened. In 1176, he was released by ransom or exchange and returned to the Crusader world older, harder, and still unrepentant. And this time, he gained a position so strategically vital that his recklessness could infect an entire kingdom.
He married Stephanie of Millie, a wealthy heiress, and through her became Lord of Ultra-Jordan, Transjordan, controlling the fortress of Kerak and the stronghold at Montreal. If you stand on those walls, you understand the temptation. Below you runs the caravan road, linking Egypt and Syria, carrying spices, silk, coin, pilgrims, letters, wealth moving like a river through desert. A responsible lord protects that road, taxes it, and keeps the peace when treaties are signed. Reynold looked at that road and saw walking treasure. He could have been a shield between worlds. Instead, he became a knife. By the early 1180s, there were truces, fragile, imperfect, but real, between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin, who was unifying Muslim power in the region. Reynold treated those truces as if they didn't apply to him. Around 1181, he attacked a rich caravan traveling under the protection of that peace. It wasn't a battle, it was banditry with a noble signature. When Saladin demanded restitution, the Crusader leadership was forced into an impossible position. They knew Reynold's action could ignite war, but Reynold was a powerful vassal sitting behind stone walls, and he refused to give anything back. He acted as if the king's word meant nothing inside Kerak. And once he realized he could do it once and survive, he became bolder. Then he did something so audacious that it felt like blasphemy made physical. He built ships. Not at the sea, at Kerak. He had them dismantled into pieces and carried across the desert on camels to the Red Sea, and in the early 1180s, commonly placed around 1182, those ships were launched as a raiding force. Frankish raiders on the Red Sea. To the Muslim world, that wasn't just piracy, it was a violation of the waters that led towards the holy cities. It spread panic. It made people fear that crusaders might strike ports tied to pilgrimage routes, that nothing was safe. Even other crusaders looked at Reynold and saw a liability, a man whose appetite could destroy everything they were trying to hold in the east. Saladin certainly saw it that way, and from this point on, the story takes on the shape of a vow. Saladin swore that he would kill Reynold with his own hands, a king's vow, a warrior's vow, a vow made not in anger alone, but in the cold understanding that if Reynold lived, peace could not hold. Reynold kept playing his game anyway, because men like him always believe the next stone wall will protect them from the consequences of their last crime. He became a kingmaker, backing claimants in Jerusalem's political chaos. He kept raiding, he kept provoking, and with every provocation, he helped push the region towards a war that would break the Crusader kingdom's backbone. But in this chapter, we end before the final payment comes due, because the next step is the one that makes the desert itself feel like it's watching. Another caravan, another raid, and the man in a pavilion, calm, disciplined, patient, deciding that the time has come. Reynold of Chatillon thinks he's untouchable behind stone, but the desert has a long memory, and Saladin's vow is walking towards him.
Night at Kerak is the kind of dark that makes you feel the desert is listening. Wind slides through the cracks of the stone like a knife. Torches gutter and flare, and far below the fortress, the caravan road winds through the valleys, quiet, steady, and alive with wealth. If you stand on those walls long enough, you start to understand why Reynold of Chatillon couldn't leave it alone. That road was a vein, and Reynold wanted to squeeze it until it bled gold. In the early 1180s, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin had truces, fragile, tense, but real. The Crusader state needed time. Saladin needed time. Peace wasn't friendship, it was a pause to breathe. Reynold treated that pause like permission. He struck caravans moving under the protection of the truce, taking goods, taking prisoners, taking the kind of profit that looks like victory to a man who doesn't care what comes after. Envoys came demanding restitution. The king of Jerusalem and his council understood the danger immediately. Reynold's raids weren't just theft, they were sparks in dry grass. But Reynold refused to return anything.
He stood behind his walls and acted as if treaties signed by kings were meaningless outside his gate. And once a man breaks a promise and survives, he often grows bolder. Reynaud didn't stop at the caravan road. He decided to do something that sounded like madness even to other crusaders. He would attack the Red Sea. Think about what that meant. The Red Sea wasn't just water. It was a corridor of pilgrimage, trade, and spiritual meaning. It was tied to the routes leading toward the holy cities. It was not a place Frankish warlords were supposed to reach, much less raid. Reynaud made it possible by combining brute ambition with cold logistics. He had ships built inland. Then he had them taken apart into pieces and carried across the desert on camelback. Planks, ribs, fittings, ropes, loaded and hauled for days through heat and rock until they reached the Gulf of Aqaba. Then the ships were reassembled on the shore and launched. When those raiding craft slipped into the Red Sea, panic spread fast along the coast. Ports that had never feared Frankish sails suddenly feared them. Merchant vessels became prey. Coastal towns sent riders inland with warnings. People whispered that the Crusaders might even reach places that felt unthinkable to threaten. In a world where reputation can be as destructive as fire, Reynaud had just poured oil onto everything. And Saladin understood the meaning instantly. This wasn't a normal raid. It wasn't a border skirmish. It was a violation designed to humiliate, to terrorize, and to prove that treaties meant nothing. So Saladin moved with the speed of a man who knows exactly what kind of threat this is. He organized pursuit. He tightened security. He hunted down raiding parties. He made sure the message was clear. These waters were not a playground for pirates. But there was an even clearer message forming in Saladin's mind, one that would not be written in letters. He swore an oath. He would kill Reynaud himself. Not someone will punish him, not he will be dealt with. Saladin's vow was personal, because Reynaud's crimes were personal to the people who suffered them, to the merchants robbed, to the travelers frightened, to the sense of sacred safety that had been violated. While Saladin's resolve hardened, Jerusalem's politics frayed. The Crusader kingdom was already unstable. Sick kings, rival claimants, factions of nobles fighting each other for influence. And Reynaud, instead of being restrained, inserted himself into that chaos as a kingmaker, backing whichever side served him. That kind of man is always dangerous, not because he holds the crown, but because he can tilt the crown. By 1187, the region tipped into full war. The Crusader army marched out to meet Saladin, and the summer heat became a weapon. This is the part of the story where people often imagine glorious charges and shining armor, but what killed the Crusaders at Hattin wasn't just steel, it was thirst. The land around the horns of Hattin was dry and unforgiving. Heat shimmer danced above the ground. Smoke drifted across the field as brush burned. Water supplies failed. Men staggered under armor that felt heavier with every step. Horses slowed. Lines broke. Morale cracked. When you're dehydrated, discipline collapses faster than walls. And at Hattin, the Crusader army collapsed. After the defeat, the captives were gathered. Exhausted men sitting in dust, heads lowered, bound hands trembling with fatigue. The battlefield quieted in that terrible way it always does after catastrophe. Not peaceful, just emptied. King Guy of Lusignan was captured. So were many leading nobles. Reynaud was captured too. And this is where Saladin's vow finally steps onto the stage. Reynaud was brought into Saladin's presence. The setting matters, a pavilion with lantern light and calm guards, order replacing chaos. Saladin was not a man of wild rage. He was controlled, deliberate. That's what made him frightening. There is a scene recorded in multiple traditions that captures the symbolism of this moment. Saladin offered a drink, cool water, to King Guy. In that culture, offering a drink could be a sign of mercy, a signal that the man would live. Guy accepted. Then, perhaps out of reflex, perhaps out of courtesy, he handed the cup toward Reynald. Saladin stopped him. He made it clear the mercy was for Guy, not for Reynald, because sharing a cup could mean sharing protection, and Saladin had no intention of granting Reynald protection. Reynald stood there dusty and stubborn, facing the man he had spent years provoking like a child poking a lion through bars. But the bars were gone now. No fortress wall, no political shield, no escape route. Just consequence. Saladin spoke to him, calmly, firmly, reminding him of broken treaties, of raids, of the Red Sea outrage, of caravans attacked under sworn peace. Exactly what was said varies by source, but the heart of it is consistent. Reynald had made his name by breaking promises. Now he stood before a man who treated promises as law. The end came quickly. Saladin drew his sword, not in a frenzy, but with measured certainty, and he struck. We don't need gore to understand what happened. The chronicles describe it plainly enough. Reynald was killed, and the oath was fulfilled. In that moment, the Crusader captives watched in stunned silence. They saw a line drawn in the sand. Mercy can be granted, but it can also be withheld, and no rank will protect you if you have pushed the world too far. Reynald's death was not the end of the catastrophe. It was part of it, because the destruction at Hattin broke the Crusader kingdom's ability to defend itself, and within months, Jerusalem fell. It's tempting to blame one man for everything, and many Christian writers did exactly that, pointing to Reynald as the spark that turned tension into inferno. He wasn't the only cause, but he was a perfect example of how one reckless, unrestrained lord can poison an entire political system. Reynald's story is the dark mirror of rebellion. Hereward defied an empire to protect his homeland. Rodrigo defied kings to build a city kingdom. Reynald defied everyone, friend and enemy alike, because he couldn't accept limits. And in the end, he didn't fall to a larger army alone. He fell to the oldest force in politics and war. The cost of breaking your word again and again until someone decides to collect. When the dust of Hattin settled, the land seemed to hold its breath. The horns of the hill stood black against the sky. Smoke drifted away, and the Red Sea, those violated waters, continued to move under the sun, indifferent, washing traces of men away as if they had never existed. But the consequences of one man's arrogance didn't wash away so easily. They changed the history of an entire region. And as the story turns away from the desert, away from the pavilion, away from the fallen kingdom, we shift toward another kind of rebel, one who doesn't always lift a sword, a man who can ignite war with a song. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the Middle Ages isn't steel, it's a voice.
I heard Bertrand before I ever met him. His music sounded like metal striking metal, bright, hard, and ringing, and his words were like a thin blade. They slid past the ear, and only afterward you felt the sting. This was Bertrand de Born, a minor lord of Hautefort, a knight, and, more dangerous than either of those, a troubadour. In that age, poetry wasn't just for love. Poetry was news. It was propaganda. It was recruitment. A song could ride farther than a messenger and sink deeper than a spear. And Bertrand used it like a man who knows he's holding a torch in a room full of dry straw. To understand him, you have to understand the world he moved in, the Plantagenet world, where family behaved like a pack of wolves. Henry II ruled an empire that stretched from England deep into France. From the outside, it looked immense, almost unbeatable. But it had one weakness, right at its heart: his sons. Henry the young king,
Richard, who would later be called Lionheart, Geoffrey, John, each of them ambitious, each of them restless. They rebelled, they made peace, then they rebelled again. The court was like a furnace. If it cooled for even a moment, it risked going out. And in that world, going out meant dying. And in that furnace, Bertrand was the man who blew on the coals. He loved war the way other men loved wine. There's a famous song of his, let's say it in the spirit of what he wrote, where he praises spring not only because it brings flowers and green leaves, but because it brings tents on open fields, banners snapping in the wind, horns calling men to their places, the noise of armies gathering like a festival. To him, war was joy, a noble joy. Peace was the thing that made men soft. Peace was the lullaby that put a realm to sleep. I once sat in a great hall and listened while he performed for young knights. I watched their eyes brighten. That was the frightening part. Not that the poetry was obviously false, no, it was seductive. It made violence feel clean. It made ambition feel like virtue. It made the sound of armor and the sight of banners feel like meaning itself. And then his song became an accusation. Bertrand attached himself to Henry the young king, the eldest son, crowned in name but powerless in reality. A king without authority is a humiliating thing to be. You carry the symbol, but you don't hold the lever. You wear the title, but you can't command the world to obey. Bertrand understood that shame, and he turned it into music. And when the rebellions rose, first in the early 1770s, then again later, Bertrand threw his weight behind the sons against the father. Chroniclers would later label him an instigator. Maybe he didn't decide the strategy or move the troops, but he did something that can be just as decisive. He gave anger a melody. He made dissatisfaction feel like destiny. And then the young king died, 1183, during campaign, sick and weakening. Most accounts call it dysentery. Before he died, he asked to be forgiven. His father, Henry II, was devastated, and in grief, people look for a name to hold responsible. They look for someone to blame because pain without a target is unbearable. Bertrand became that name. And then Richard came. At that time, Richard was still the king's son, still enforcing his father's will. He led troops against Hautefort. The castle was besieged. Bertrand was captured. I can imagine that courtyard, the poet of war bound like a criminal, hearing stones slam into walls, hearing the wood of siege engines creak, and realizing that his beautiful verses had always been made of the same materials as this: fear, pressure, hunger, and blood. There's a tradition that says Bertrand wrote a lament, a plaint for the dead young king, and that the poem softened Henry II's heart, that the words were good enough to bend wrath into mercy. Maybe that detail was embroidered. People love the idea that art can buy life back from the edge. But whether the story is polished or not, one thing is clear: Bertrand survived. He didn't vanish. He remained in the world, and he kept writing. A man like that doesn't stop simply because he's been punished once. And he didn't just survive. He continued to meddle, to provoke, to lean into the tensions that kept Europe's rulers at each other's throats. Even later, he found ways to push at the rivalry between Richard and Philip II of France, with sharp satire and hungry counsel, as if war was always the most honest answer. Eventually, age caught up with him. He withdrew to a monastery, often linked to the Cistercians at the Lawn. Some said he was seeking forgiveness. Some said he was simply tired. Sometimes the difference is hard to see from the outside. But the world didn't let him rest. More than 100 years later, Dante wrote his Inferno, and he dragged Bertrand back onto the stage, not as a man, but as a symbol. Dante places him among the sowers of discord, and he gives him a punishment designed for a poet. Bertrand carries his own severed head like a lantern, because his tongue split father from son. I don't stand with Dante. Dante was a poet too, and poets judge through images. They don't need evidence the way courts do. They need meaning. But Bertrand still leaves me with a question I can't shake. How many people can a sentence kill? Sometimes more than a sword. Far more. A sword ends one life at a time. A song can start a war that eats thousands. And then I left Limousin. Years passed. Roads changed. Names changed. Transition. Because in England, I would meet another kind of rebel. Someone who didn't only stir conflict with words and didn't only break things with steel. Someone who tried, in the ash and smoke of civil war, to forge new law out of what was left behind.
His name was Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, French-born, yet destined to become the face of an English rebellion. He wasn't like Hereward, the outlaw of the marshes. He wasn't like Rodrigo, carving out a kingdom on his own. Simon was something else entirely. A high nobleman standing right at the center of the royal court and then turning his spear toward the very heart of it. Simon married Eleanor, the sister of King Henry III. For a time, he was family, close enough to power to touch it. But Henry III ruled through shifting favors, leaning heavily on foreign advisors, demanding money, and slowly pushing many English barons into a shared frustration. They felt their feudal rights being chipped away piece by piece. By 1258, that pressure finally took shape as a document with a dangerous idea: the Provisions of Oxford. It was an attempt to place the king under the supervision of a council, limits, oversight, rules. Not a revolution in the modern sense, but a clear message: the crown could not govern purely on impulse. Simon was one of the strongest voices behind it. Henry, of course, tried to undo those restraints, and when a king refuses to be bound, the argument stops being legal and starts being violent. In 1264, civil war broke out. Simon was in his 50s by then, but he still carried the force of someone who believed he had a mission. He led forces against the king, and in May of that year, at the Battle of Lewes, he won a decisive victory. What happened next flipped the feudal world upside down. King Henry III was captured, and so was his son, Prince Edward, the man who would later become Edward I. For a moment, it looked like Simon might do what powerful rebels often do: rule in the king's name, cut a deal with the barons, redistribute influence, and call it finished. But Simon went further than the battlefield. He called a parliament. In early 1265, he summoned an assembly that later generations would remember as Montfort's Parliament. The bold part wasn't that nobles and churchmen attended; that was expected. The shift was that Simon also called in knights from the counties and representatives from towns, burgesses, men tied to trade, records, and money rather than ancient titles. It wasn't democracy, not even close. Most people still had no voice at all. But it was a door opening, just a crack. And if you imagine that hall, you can almost feel the tension in the air. Townsmen with ink-stained hands standing near aristocrats draped in fur and tradition. People who knew deep down that this room wasn't built for them, and yet here they were, invited to listen and, carefully, to speak.
Simon stood in the middle of it all like a stake driven into a fast-moving river. He believed he was saving the kingdom by tying power to law, by forcing the crown to share space with something sturdier than royal will. But power doesn't like being tied down, and the struggle fought back with a name: Edward. Edward escaped captivity, and once he was free, he moved fast, using speed, planning, and misdirection to isolate Simon from his allies. By August of 1265, the two sides met near Evesham. There's a line preserved in the Chronicles. When Simon saw banners approaching, banners he believed belonged to his supporters, he's said to have cried out something like, "They come as if from heaven." Then he realized the truth. Those weren't friendly standards at all. Edward had captured them and turned them into bait. Evesham wasn't a balanced battle. It was an execution carried out with swords. Simon fought. His son fought too. But once the trap closed, there was no exit, only the choice of how to die. And Simon de Montfort died as a knight, not on a scaffold, but in the mud and blood of the field, surrounded, overwhelmed, and unbroken in the final moment. The victors still weren't satisfied. They mutilated his body. They tried to erase him through humiliation, to make sure his memory carried only disgust and warning, nothing noble, nothing worth repeating. But history has its own cruel irony. The more the powerful tried to bury Simon's meaning, the more it grew in the minds of others. People, commoners, and even some clergy began to speak of miracles near the place where he fell. They whispered that he was a martyr for justice. The king tried to shut it down, to stamp out the story. But you can't forbid belief the way you forbid a meeting. You can't outlaw a symbol once it's taken root. And that's the paradox at the heart of power. Sometimes, the harder you try to erase a man, the deeper you carve him into memory.
Hereward, his clothes damp with marsh fog. Rodrigo, dust on his cloak, eyes fixed on the distance, like he's staring out at the sea. Reynald, smelling of iron, and ambition that still hasn't cooled. Bertrand, one hand resting on a lute string the way someone might rest a hand on a knife's edge. Simon, tired eyes, the eyes of a man who truly believes law can outlast the sword. And me? I'm standing just outside that circle of light, like a reader stepping into the page of a chronicle. And I ask them, while really I'm asking myself, what does it mean to be a traitor? Hereward rose against William because his homeland was taken. In the eyes of an empire, he's a troublemaker, a bandit, a nuisance in the wetlands. But in the eyes of the fenlands, of people who watch their homes change hands, he becomes a watchman, a flame left burning in a storm. It depends who gets to write the record. If the court writes history, Hereward is the disturbance. If the dispossessed write history, Hereward is the lamp. And maybe that's the first thing he teaches us. Some rebellions aren't chasing a crown. They're chasing the right to stand upright without asking permission. Then there's Rodrigo, exiled, pushed to the edge, and instead of breaking, he turns exile into leverage. He fights for whoever pays. He learns the rules of survival in the margins. And in the end, he carves out his own seat of power in Valencia, something that looks an awful lot like a court,
built by a man who was told he didn't deserve one. You can call him an opportunist. You can call him a genius. But either way, Rodrigo proves something unsettling. At the edge of power, a person with enough nerve can build a new kind of power. And he leaves behind a hard lesson, one that doesn't sound noble, but sounds true. Loyalty can be a luxury, and sometimes survival is the price you pay before loyalty can mean anything at all. Reinald is different. Reinald doesn't break treaties for principle. He breaks them for appetite, for profit, for the thrill of crossing a line and daring the world to respond. He mixes the language of holy war with the reality of raiding, and the bill doesn't come due to him alone. An entire kingdom ends up paying it. His lesson is as cold as the water at Hattin. When rebellion has no moral boundary, it stops being resistance. It becomes self-destruction. And it doesn't just burn the rebel, it drags everyone nearby into the fire. And then we meet Bertrand. Bertrand doesn't need to kill with his own hands. He only needs to make other men believe war is beautiful, that violence is glorious, that rebellion is romantic. A well-placed verse can do what a blade cannot. It can make people want the blade. And that's his uncomfortable truth. A poem at the right moment can ignite an uprising. And the one who fans the flames can still claim clean hands, because it was only art. Finally, Simon. Simon de Montfort turns against the very center of power, captures a king and calls a parliament. He dies under the sword, but the idea he fought for outlives him. And what Simon teaches is a paradox that history repeats again and again. Some rebellions, if they fail, are labeled betrayal. But if they last, if they survive long enough to reshape the future, they get renamed. They become reform. So where does that leave us? It brings me back to the image of the hammer and the anvil. For John Marshall, it was a cold line spoken before a castle wall. But for these so-called rebel knights, the hammer and the anvil feel like the machinery of history itself. The hammer is war. The anvil is society. And every blow forges a new shape of power. Sometimes it forges freedom. Sometimes it forges chaos. Sometimes it forges law. Sometimes it forges disaster. And me, I'm only the narrator, the one picking up steel fragments that flew out of the furnace of an age, laying them on the table in front of you and asking, if you had lived then, would you have called them heroes or traitors? Wind moves through the marshes of Ely. Waves strike the shore at Valencia. Sand lifts and spirals along the caravan road to Carac. A lute echoes in Limousin, and in Westminster, bells tremble in the rain. And somewhere, history raises the hammer again, getting ready to bring it down one more time.